It's Tuesday, it's 9:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me today, Conservative MP Tom Hunt, the SNP's David Linden, Novara Media contributing editor Ash Sarkar and Annabel Denham of the Institute of Economic Affairs. No more compulsion in England. We'll have to decide how to behave.
If we can't reopen our society in the next few weeks, we must ask ourselves, when will we be able to return to normal?
We are in the face of an increasing epidemic at the moment, and therefore we need to behave accordingly in terms of trying to limit transmissions.
Labour say it's reckless.
Thousands upon thousands younger people will be exposed to the virus, and many of them will develop serious long-term health conditions.
Will Priti Patel's crackdown on illegal migrants stop any more of these small boats landing in Kent?
These British gas shares, it couldn't be easier to do.
Most young people wish this had never happened. Should capitalists be worried? So, last night, Boris Johnson all but confirmed the restrictions of COVID would be lifted on the 19th of July. Let's take a look at some of the newspapers and their headlines and how they covered it. Starting with the Daily Telegraph, it's now or never, says Boris Johnson. Contrasting headline in the Mirror, which has this: Freedom Day confirmed, but masking for trouble. The Sun had something slightly different relating to the football, of course. It's now or never, free Lions, and finishing up with the Guardian's take. Johnson sweeps away lockdown restrictions in COVID-19 gamble. My question to open today's programme with the guests is this a reckless gamble or a calculated risk? Tom?
I think it's the right thing. I think obviously the Prime Minister's been cautious. There was a roadmap, he delayed the roadmap so we could have extra time to get those double jabs in, which are more resistant to the Delta variant in particular. But I think I agree with the Prime Minister, if not now, when? And I think that we can say, is this reckless? Is it reckless to continue having restrictions that are, in many cases, even now, having such a negative impact on the lives and the livelihoods and the mental health of millions of people up and down the country? So we've got to get back to normal, and I support the Prime Minister fully on this.
David, what's your view? Is it reckless or a calculated risk?
Well, look, I think we all want to get back to normality as quickly as possible. I hear that regularly from the businesses in my constituency, but I'm a bit concerned that there'll be a degree of mixed messaging coming from the UK government, particularly on the issue of face coverings. We in Scotland have already said that we can foresee that there'll be a need for face coverings going forward. We're very much in the ascendancy of this third wave with the Delta variant at the moment, and it strikes me as being just a little bit bizarre that we've got this kind of gung-ho attitude from the UK government. Now in Scotland, we will set out, there'll be a statement in the Scottish Parliament next week about the situation that we're in terms of unlocking the economy, but I think there will be some pretty significant differences between Scotland and the rest of the UK, most notably on face coverings.
All right, we'll talk about that actually a little later on. Annabel, your view, is it a reckless move or a welcome return to normality?
I agree with Tom. I think if you look at the data, the link between cases and deaths has certainly been severed. No one knows exactly what's going to happen when we reopen. Not Boris Johnson, not Keir Starmer, not Chris Whitty, but we can be fairly sure that when we do, it will lead to a surge in infections. So why not now? Of course, there are concerns around long COVID, and I suspect that we're going to hear a lot more about this in the coming weeks and months. But I think that the government is right to present people with the risks and allow us to make judgments.
Ash?
My concern here is that I think that the Prime Minister has presented something of a false binary, because obviously all of us want to get back to normal. I personally would climb over my grandmother to get back in the club. But that doesn't mean that we don't have to make these small adjustments, like, for instance, wearing face coverings on public transport and in the shops, which facilitate us being able to embrace these other freedoms. So my worry is that by presenting it as all or nothing, now or never, we're either completely free or completely restricted, is that actually what the Prime Minister is doing is weakening the resolve of people to make these adjustments to their behaviour, which can keep us all safe and allow us to embrace a greater degree of freedom.
Tom?
Well, I don't agree. I think that there could well be instances where we exercise our common sense and decide to wear a mask in a crowded setting, for example. I imagine if I was in a train and there was no one in my carriage, I wouldn't wear a face mask. If I was in a carriage and it was packed, I probably would wear a face mask. That's an example of common sense. We are free people, ultimately, and I think that's what we need to get back to, exercising our common sense and our resolve.
Right, well, let's listen to the Health Secretary, Sajid Javid. He was interviewed this morning on the BBC, and this is how he sees it.
I do expect case numbers to be a lot higher. So one figure I've just shared with you that I've seen, and again, it's all estimates here, that we are in uncharted territory, and that's true across the world, not just here in the UK, but the case numbers could be 50,000 a day by July 19th, and during the summer, I expect them to continue increasing for a while until they start falling.
We'll look at the figures in a bit more detail in a moment. Let's catch up with our chief political correspondent, Adam Fleming. It's not risk-free, is it, Adam?
No, and actually, if you look at some of the papers published by SAGE, the Scientific Advisory Group, alongside the government announcement yesterday, there's one from the SPI-M and SPI-B groups, as they're known, and they say in black and white, this strategy of having a high prevalence of the virus, in other words, lots of cases in the community, is a high-risk strategy. And they say it means it doesn't give you a lot of headroom if something goes wrong, and it makes it harder to spot local outbreaks where a problem could be developing. It also gives you more scope for new variants to develop, and you could have a variant that escapes the vaccine, and we'd be in real trouble then. And also the point that several other people have been making already about long COVID, that the more people that get COVID, the more people are going to have long-term health problems from it.
Right, well, I said we'd look at the figures. Adam, I'm going to show two graphs on cases and hospital admissions in England. These graphs have been done by a mathematician. You can see there on the first graph the 7-day average of English cases. It's a log graph which shows exponential growth, which is how pandemics grow. The current doubling time is 9 days. So, in 9 days' time, the numbers will double from the current figures, which are over 27,000 new positive cases in the last 24 hours. Let's take a look at the second graph. That shows hospital admissions in England. Now, this, of course, is a very important measure, so says the government, in terms of making sure that the NHS can cope. And you can see 358 patients were admitted on the 29th of June. That's the latest data available. The doubling time for hospitalisations is 16 days. Now, Boris Johnson, Adam, set expectations high when he said that all restrictions would be lifted on July the 19th. But we're still a week away. It felt like a sort of pre-announcement announcement, and there is still more data to come. So will it absolutely happen?
Well, in theory, the decision will not be made about the step 4 of the roadmap and the lifting of the other restrictions until next Monday, ahead of the 19th of July. And the ministers will look at the data over the weekend and on Monday and decide whether or not to go ahead. But politically, the signal has been sent that this is definitely happening. I can't really see what would happen other than maybe the arrival of a very new, very dangerous variant in the next day or two that would derail this. But it does raise the whole question, those two graphs, about what the government strategy is here. The fact is that you've got the vaccine that is loosening the link between the number of people getting COVID and then the number of people going into hospital and potentially dying from COVID as well. It means we're in a very different situation from previous waves. And that means it gives the power to the government to choose when to have the next wave of COVID cases. And they've made a choice that it's better to have it now as the weather gets a bit warmer, as the summer holidays are about to start and NHS capacity is looking okay. You have that wave now, because the alternative would be to have it later in the year when the NHS will be under a lot more strain from the flu strain that is inevitably going to hit the UK after a winter of lockdown. Or you keep restrictions in place and you then do this unlocking next spring in 2022. So that is the entire basis, those two graphs, for the government strategy doing this.
Right, well, that is obviously the thinking. And Sajid Javid, the Health Secretary, did go on to say in another interview that cases could rise to 100,000 a day at some point over the summer.
Yeah, and that's the kind of cognitive dissonance you have watching this whole story unfold, in that your first reaction as a human being when you hear the Health Secretary say there's going to be 100,000 cases is one of kind of shock. And you think, wow, that's a lot of cases, because we've all been trained to look at that graph and worry about the numbers. But then the more rational COVID observer steps in and you think, well, that's obvious because of the doubling time you just talked about. If there's 50,000 cases 2 weeks on Monday, well, then there'll be 100,000 cases 2 weeks following that. The key thing is it does not translate into a large number of hospitalizations. Although if it did, and maybe there is a certain number of cases way beyond 100,000 that does lead to a certain number of hospitalizations that would threaten the NHS, well, then the government would have to change course. But they seem pretty confident in their modelling, in their equations, and the link between the vaccine and the hospitalizations that we're not going to get to that stage. Chris Whitty said the peak of this wave will come towards the end of the summer, and it will not go beyond the capacity of the NHS to respond.
Right, now, Adam, take us through some of the things that we don't know yet for certain, but I think we're going to hear either later today or certainly this week, which is around self-isolation rules, and if you're double vaccinated, whether you will now be liberated to a certain extent from the existing rules, and also school bubbles that have been in place will be scrapped from July the 19th. Is there anything else we're waiting to hear?
So we'll get those two announcements today in the Commons. We'll get the Education Secretary saying that school bubbles are going to disappear, and if you're a school pupil and one of your classmates tests positive, they'll have to go home, but you will be able to continue going to school as long as you test negative with a lateral flow test every morning for a few days. That will stop the hundreds of thousands of school pupils in England having to have their education disrupted, even though they don't have COVID and they've not got any symptoms. We think that will come in on the 19th of July as well, but the idea about that is so that summer schools aren't disrupted. It will kick in for the rest of schools in England at the start of the next term after the summer holidays. We're also going to get an announcement today from the Health Secretary, we think, who will be doing the announcement that if you get contacted by Test and Trace or pinged by the app because you're a contact of someone who's tested positive, you will not have to go into quarantine for 10 days if you've had both doses of the vaccine. We're also expecting later this week a statement from the Transport Secretary, Grant Shapps, that will say a similar policy will apply for double-jabbed people who return to the UK from amber list countries on the government's traffic light travel system. At the moment, you have to isolate for at least 5 days if you come back from one of those countries. Now, I think the intriguing thing about some of those policies is those will be the first instances where the government has discriminated between people who've received both vaccinations and people who haven't. Now, if you've received both vaccinations, you're thinking, hooray, I can go to Spain and then come back and go straight back to work. If you're in your early 20s and you're still waiting for your second dose, you're thinking the total opposite.
Right, yes. Well, I'm not in my early 20s, but I will feel sorry for those too, of course. Adam, thank you very much. Much of what Adam was talking about, obviously, is referring to England. We have David Linden here. David, let's talk about Scotland. You mentioned masks. We'll come on to that. But Scotland is believed to have the highest COVID rate in the UK. That's according to the latest ONS figures, with estimated levels in the Scottish population 73% higher than in England. It's also said that a couple of regions in Scotland have the highest COVID case rate in Europe. NHS Tayside has the highest rate of all. What's happening?
So I think part of the problem that we've had is that the Delta variant, which we know is 40% more transmissible, has been seeded in certainly my own city of Glasgow, most densely populated city in the country. Now, one of the reasons why we're on this league table perhaps for the first time is we don't have those levels of natural immunity that perhaps other people in the UK might have. So we saw much earlier in the pandemic places like London much higher up that league table. We want to try and get Scotland down from that league table as quickly as possible. So that's why we're asking people in this month of July to go along, get jagged, make sure as well that you're doing your twice weekly lateral flow tests. There's an awful lot of work that's going on to try and reduce that virus, but there's no doubt that the Delta variant, now I've got major problems about how the UK government has handled border control in the UK, but there's no doubt that Delta variant being seeded in some of these most densely populated cities like Dundee and like Glasgow has caused us a number of problems.
Well, one of the interesting issues, because it is around hospitalisations and weakening that link. So with your higher figures in certain regions, how are hospitals coping?
So I think the hospitals at the moment are coping very well, and I would pay tribute to the NHS staff who are working flat out to do that. But the most important thing that people can do here is make sure that they're going and getting their vaccine when they're called forward, and that includes their their second dose as well. Don't forget, if you've only had your first dose, that doesn't mean you've got complete immunity from this. But also, in the meantime, make sure that you're doing that regular testing and follow facts. So wear face coverings, avoid crowded spaces, clean your hands and surfaces regularly, adhere to that 2 metre social distancing, and self-isolate if you show symptoms and book a test.
Right. What about the timetable then in Scotland? Do you think it will be delayed, the easing of restrictions in July?
Well, at the moment, we're working to a framework and we are looking at that data every day, sometimes on an hourly basis. And ministers are concerned about the data that we're seeing at the moment. But a statement will be made by the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, next week to the Scottish Parliament, taking account of the data. But there's no doubt that I think in making that decision, we need to be sure that we're on the descendancy of
right. So you want to see those? You want to see those figures
down. I think that
before July the 19th.
It would certainly be concerning if you move ahead in the way that the UK government has done to kind of proclaim Freedom Day when numbers are going up. And I think that's a point that's at the back of ministers' minds. But we are very much working to a framework that's been set out by the government at the moment, and a statement will be made in Parliament next week. Just
briefly, you mentioned masks earlier. Do you think they should stay mandatory in Scotland?
I'm deeply alarmed about the idea of populist politicians talking about chucking away their masks. I think it's more important in the height of a pandemic to listen to public health experts rather than politicians who like to go for populist headlines like we see in front of us.
Tom?
Well, I mean, I think we had a very good analysis actually about explaining why the government have taken the strategy they've taken. I think we're just simply in a very different position. Cases are not the key thing here. It is hospitalisations, it is the number of deaths, and the vaccine has totally changed the game. And in terms of this, I mean, we all want to see cases low in the community, but ultimately this idea that if cases are high, we could lead to more variants, I mean, ultimately that leads to never ending in terms of lockdowns. At some point, we've got to say back to normal, and to me, this seems like a logical time to do it.
Right, well, let's have a look at this headline in the Daily Mail with the warning, freedom may only last for weeks. Experts raise fears of another autumn lockdown and warn some changes to our lifestyles could be permanent because allowing COVID cases to rise is a significant risk. What's your response to that, Tom?
There are many different scientific figures in this country, and there is not a consensus of thinking on all of the different issues. So they're entitled to have that view. I, for one, hope and believe that 19th of July will be a permanent move back to normality.
But you accept
there'll be challenges in the winter, but I hope and believe we'll not be in a position where we have to go back into the types of lockdowns we've been seeing and to see the types of restrictions we've been seeing.
Right. Well, Ash, what's your response to that warning? It also came from some of the experts on Sage.
So look, I think the problem here is that you've got the government trying to sell the public a dream. And what they want is this top line, great optics, Freedom Day, we're going to be cautious and we're going to be irreversible. And the fact is that you've got to pick one. You can be cautious and data driven, or you can make a promise which you may not be able to keep, that the unlocking will be irreversible regardless of what goes on with case numbers, hospitalizations and variants. And the point that I'm making is that actually you are able to return to normalcy if we maintain some adjustments in terms of our behaviour. Face coverings might be one of them. Being responsive to outbreaks and willing to move quickly to contain them is another. Being able to move quickly when it comes to restricting travel from hotspot countries where new variants emerge, that's another thing that we need the government to do. Whereas at the moment, I don't think that politicians are being that straight with the public, that in order to be able to do what they say we have to do, which is live with the virus, we can't just pretend that it doesn't exist. We have to have a responsive and responsible government willing to act quickly and willing to be honest with us that we do have to retain these changes to our behaviour in our daily lives.
Annabelle?
I think that there's a problem at the moment whereby some in the Labour Party and perhaps Ash and many members of the public seem to think that staying on step 3, that having these non-pharmaceutical interventions in place like social distancing, like rules of 6, like face masks, don't come with an economic cost. But I'm afraid that they do. A lot of businesses operate at the margins, shops, cafes, all of these places are really suffering. They're hanging on by their fingertips. And if we keep these restrictions in place, that could push them, if not into the red, then it could push them to just throw in the towel. So I think that, I'm not a virologist, but if you look at the data, it's all very encouraging. We've had this vaccination rollout. It's been absolutely phenomenal. That should allow us to reopen. But reopening needs to mean going back to normality. It needs to mean a full restitution of our freedoms, because not doing that does come with an economic cost that I think a lot of people are downplaying.
Ash?
But what's the economic costs of face coverings? Can you just tell me that? Because what I'm talking about is that being able to do things like end social distancing, get back in the nightclubs, revive our hospitality industry, is that it will mean that we have to have these other changes to our behaviour, like QR codes, checking in, a really good test, trace and isolate system, and face coverings. So can you just tell me the economic cost of face coverings? Because I don't get it.
Annabelle?
Well, I think it's very difficult to quantify because you have risk compensation. You don't know how people's behaviour will change in other ways, and whether these nudges are additive, whether people are going to wear a face mask, but that means they don't adhere to social distancing. So it can be quite difficult to quantify the exact cost of them. But I would say that for every person who's nervous about going into a shop because people aren't wearing face masks, you have many people who don't want to go to the movies and sit in a face covering for 2 hours. It's undoubtedly going to have an effect on businesses. And that's just talking about patrons or customers. What about the people who work in these shops or hair salons? And they've got to bear the cost of providing protective equipment to their staff. So, as I say, I just don't think that we can downplay the fact that these non-pharmaceutical interventions do cost businesses, and they can make the difference between businesses surviving and them folding.
But those businesses have to bear the cost of their staff getting sick. So when I worked in a pub, I was a really bad barmaid, I was really grumpy, right? It was me that would have to cover the cost of either taking a day off unpaid or my employer having to pay me sick pay. And that would be worse than having to wear a face covering so I can keep working. And so that's the thing, is that I feel that you're living in cloud cuckoo land where we can get rid of everything and there'll be no effects. What I'm saying is that in order for us to facilitate these freedoms that we all want to have, you are going to have to put up with some of these minor inconveniences, because the much greater inconvenience is people getting sick en masse, even if you don't have a huge increase in hospitalizations. And I'm really glad that we're not having a massive increase in hospitalizations because the vaccine's doing its job. You still have people taking time off work. Getting coronavirus really sucks. And you have this risk of long COVID, as many as perhaps 1 in 5 people suffering from long-term effects of having had coronavirus.
Before we move on, did you want to say something, Tom?
Well, I think the reality is, I think that there are risks every day that we take. I think if we're going to start restricting people's freedoms and liberties in the way that we've done, the bar needs to be set very, very high. And that bar was met when we didn't have vaccines, but now we have vaccines. It has dramatically changed the situation. Therefore, I totally disagree with what Ash has just said and sympathise with what Annabelle said.
All right, before we move on, just to let you know, I've been told the entire English cricket team is having to self-isolate. Let me just show you this newspaper headline, because we're going to talk about moves by Priti Patel, the Home Secretary, to cut down and crack down on the illegal trade of migrants crossing in small boats over the Channel. This is Priti Patel. This sickening trade in humans by vile gangs must end. This comes ahead of a bill being published tomorrow, an immigration bill. We don't have the details as yet, but what we understand is that there will be a new offence for those arriving in the UK without what is called a valid entry clearance, and target people traffickers with penalties for aiding illegal immigration. Now, the change is intended to help authorities to prosecute migrants who attempt to travel to Britain on those small boats and are intercepted by border force officers. At the moment, and entering the country without leave doesn't cover migrants intercepted and then brought to shore by border force officers. Tom, will this actually put anyone off crossing the Channel?
Well, I hope so. But ultimately, I think if you've made the conscious decision to leave another, because they're coming from a safe European country, another safe European country, France, you've decided to break UK immigration law to come over here, I think that you should be held to account for that. I mean, ultimately, these are individuals who are coming from France. They're not coming directly from a war-torn country. And I think the government is right to be taking a more robust approach to this. My constituents are very angry by what they've seen, the images they've seen. And I actually think this limits our capacity to show compassion towards the most genuine of refugees who are fleeing directly from these war-torn countries. So, yes, a step in the right direction.
David?
Well, I think in this whole process, Joe, I mean, I think of the 3-year-old toddler, Alan Kurdi. Let's not forget, in 2015, those incredibly moving images of a toddler washed up in the beach. The idea that people got on these boats or put children on these boats and they're coming to the UK for a food bank voucher really is quite offensive. And the references to asylum shopping that we've seen in the media in recent days, I think, is extremely distasteful. I represent a constituency that's got one of the highest numbers of asylum seekers in the UK. And I think that we've got to understand why it is that people sometimes are making these, really dangerous journeys, perhaps because there are no safe and legal routes to the UK. We also have to look as well about the broader treatment of asylum seekers, those dawn raids, the Napier barracks, the inhumane conditions that we keep people in. And there is a reality here that the UK's asylum system and this dog whistle politics that we hear so often from the British government is just deeply offensive and completely misses the point of the much wider issue when it comes to the treatment of asylum seekers.
Tom?
I totally disagree. Every single illegal immigrant who gets into this country and is seen to stay in this country encourages more people to try it, and that risks more of them losing their lives, and it feeds this evil trade in human lives.
So
the message needs to go out: do not try to come here illegally, because you will not be successful. We need to have a process in place. We need to have a legal process in place. And yes, make the argument for why we should take more refugees legally in the correct way. But turning a blind eye to what is illegality, lawlessness, on our channel is totally wrong.
So why not follow the advice, for example, of Amnesty International and try and open up some safe and legal routes?
Well, that's a debate. Let's have that discussion. This is a separate issue. This is about lawlessness. And it's about saying, and it's about sending out a message that, oh yeah, try it, because once you get in, you're in. What that sends, the message that sends, is it just encourages more people to do it, more people to risk their lives, and they are overwhelmingly young men in their 20s and 30s, by the way. They are, overwhelmingly.
So let's look at why it is that people are making these dangerous crossings. Now, for example, you spoke about compassion. So if the UK is so focused on compassion and people are fleeing countries because of famine and starvation, why is the UK government cutting the international aid budget and nutrition projects then?
Well, I think there's unprecedented pulls on the public purse at the moment. And I think when we're talking about, we're already giving more money than virtually any other comparable country in the world in international aid. But I think when there's unprecedented pulls on the public purse, I think prioritising domestic spend, school places, hospitals, I think is a right thing to do, and I support it.
Ash, can I return to the issue, which is, will it stop people making the crossing by tightening up the laws and the regulations in terms of when people can actually be arrested? More than 2,000 migrants have crossed the Channel on small boats in June 2021 alone, setting a new record. Is Tom right that actually all it's doing is encouraging more people to risk their lives?
Well, what we need to do is have a fact-based conversation. So you're right, there was an increase in small boat crossings in 2020, but overall, the number of asylum claims remained static. So you had this huge explosion of images, and I think a lot of scaremongering around small boat crossings and asylum claims in order to justify quite a draconian crackdown, but actually the numbers were remaining flat. So I think we need to question the way in which media coverage is warping our perceptions of what's really happening. And what is really happening is that, one, making conditions more miserable for migrants isn't really having an effect on either asylum claims or small boat crossings. We've seen the conditions in Napier barracks, which are terrible. A huge outbreak of coronavirus, a fire that was set because people were so miserable and felt so without hope that they ended up burning down their own accommodation.
Justifying that.
Tom?
She's justifying illegality.
Oh,
criminal damage. Criminal damage.
Oh, can we just have, again, a fact-based conversation?
Well, it is a fact.
Right?
They break the law.
When you've got people, if you were, hang on a second, if you were in a barracks,
I wouldn't burn it down.
Literally dozens of people around you had coronavirus, you yourself may have been deeply traumatized and suffering from PTSD because you have fled a war-torn country. Many of these people are victims of torture. Do you expect that you would behave within the same bounds of civility as you or me with our privileged existences would? No, I don't think that you would. I think the way in which you deal with I think no, wait, because I think the way in which you deal with deeply traumatized people who have fled famine, fled war. Yes, many of them haven't stayed in the first country. I was going to come to this point. Yes, many of them haven't stayed in their first country where they've arrived, but actually most of them do. The UK processes fewer asylum claims than France, Germany, Greece, and in fact, Europe overall takes fewer asylum claims than countries neighbouring the ones that people have just fled.
It does seem to me there that you have just justified individuals doing criminal damage setting fire to property, it just seems that you justified that.
I'm saying the way in which you stop this from happening, right? I want to prevent any scenes like that from ever happening again, is that you treat people like human beings. And you take a look at Brookhouse Removal Centre. The Independent Monitoring Board found that a third of detainees at Brookhouse had to be put on constant suicide watch. Do you think that's acceptable? Do you think that that's a good way to treat human beings?
What I think is acceptable is we have a system based on rules that are followed. What I think is acceptable is if somebody breaks our immigration laws and comes here from another safe European country, that we do not allow them to stay in our country. I think most people in our country, there should be clear rules that are followed. This is very much an extreme view that you've got. It's not in keeping with the majority of people in our country who are actually compassionate and do actually want to represent the most genuine of refugees. This trade in human lives makes this harder. It makes this job harder. Your position is not a compassionate position and it is not a moral position.
I'm saying expand the number of legal and safe avenues for asylum seekers to come here and lodge their claims when they're in this country. The fact is that most asylum claims don't even come to this country, and people who do want to come to this country, it's usually for reasons of language familiarity, or they've already got a support network or family here. And what's going on with these policies is that they push people out of those safe and legal routes and into the arms of the people traffickers. So if we want to have a conversation based on reality where we agree we don't want people traffickers and people who profit off human misery to be able to exploit poor and desperate people, that means expanding safe and legal routes. If what you want to do and what your government wants to do is just immiserate the lives of asylum seekers, you're not going to do anything to numbers. And all you're going to do is create more human misery.
Tom?
I think, as I say, not being robust in dealing with this issue, which is illegal immigration, limits our capacity to show compassion to these other individuals. I also think that, yes, there'll be some people who have come from this other safe European country, France, who have had a difficult lot. But actually, there'll be some who are, frankly, economic migrants. How can you say with confidence that every single one of them is a refugee fleet? You don't know that. You don't know that.
Hang on, Ash. I'm going to bring in Annabelle just briefly, and I want to get your view on it, Annabelle. But in the light of a figure from 2019, because I think that is the most up-to-date figure we have, 4,000 unauthorised Channel arrivals, fewer than the figures I've read out so far for this year, actually equalled less than 1% of all immigrants, just to put it in some perspective. But what is your view about the legislation that Priti Patel is proposing to deal with this?
Sure. So the first thing I'd say is that since World War II, the UK has been known for supporting and welcoming immigrants and to those displaced to the UK. You know, these asylum seekers face unimaginable plights of the kind that we cannot imagine living in Britain today. And I suspect, to the point on asylum shopping, that many don't actually know their final destination when they flee. I think that the government is responding to what it deems to be public hostility. And as Ash says, this may have been whipped up by the media and the images that we see splashed across the cover of newspapers. But I don't think that well, perhaps Tom can, explain why it is, but I don't think taking this hard line on asylum seekers is the right course. And I think in terms of policy, a low-hanging fruit might be to allow them to work in the UK, where they can learn English, they can integrate, and we would get the economic and social benefits from that. And to the point about this taking a hard line and that preventing other people from making a perilous journey, I'm just a little suspicious of that. I think that that's a way of people who are hostile towards asylum seekers masking it in compassionate terms.
Tom?
Totally disagree. I think ultimately, if somebody wants to move to this country because they want to make a contribution, then they should apply for immigration status like everybody else. And ultimately, we can make a determination about whether or not they should be granted immigration status or not. I mean, ultimately, it seems as though what Annabelle's arguing for is a kind of free-for-all, where anyone can just come to our country, they don't have to follow the rules, and once they're in, they're in. That is essentially what you are calling for. By making the comments that you've made, I think we have to have a rules-based immigration system, both when it comes to those who want to come here, but also in terms of with regards to refugee status. I think this kind of free-for-all, frankly, we did vote to leave. Millions of people in this country voted to leave the European Union because they wanted to take back control of our borders. And when they switch on the TV screen and they see this lawlessness It's a million miles away from control of our borders, and I can understand why we're angry. I don't think it's been whipped up by the media. I think it's understandable anger.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. I know, David, you want to come back in. We'll have to do this in even more detail on another occasion. We're going to talk about this because the think tank Annabelle works for, the Free Market Institute for Economic Affairs, has published some new research looking at the political attitudes of young people. They polled just under 2,000 people aged between 16 and 34 in the UK earlier this year, asking them about their attitudes to capitalism. Let's show you this statistic first. 67% of 16 to 34-year-olds say they would like to live in a socialist economic system. Roll on to 75% of 16 to 34-year-olds agree with the statement that socialism is a good idea, but it has failed in the past because it has been badly done. I think that will come up in just a moment. Annabelle, your think tank argues that this is a wake-up call for supporters of the market economy. But haven't young people always been more skewed and more left-wing?
Yes, they have. I mean, I suspect that this report is music to Ash's ears, and there are a few main takeaways. The first is that this millennial socialism is not a passing fad that ended when Jeremy Corbyn stood down as leader of the Labour Party. The second point, and to your question, Joe, is that young people are not growing out of socialism as they have historically done. In fact, if anything, the data suggests that they're growing into it. And that means that supporters of the market economy can no longer bury their heads in the sand. They can no longer shrug their shoulders and just assume that it's a phase that people will grow out of, nor is it to be assumed as an abstract aspiration, because that's what people said about Brexit, and look where we are now. And a final point, I would just say that this polling was trying to establish what young people currently believe, wasn't suggesting what we believe that they should think. And actually, if we're arguing against anybody in this report, it's those on our own side who have become quite complacent about the anti-capitalist backlash that we're seeing among the young. They're choosing to just dismiss it or even deny it when it's quite obviously happening.
Right. Well, before I get Ash's response, Tom, do you still believe in capitalism, or has your generation become a bit complacent?
Well, I'm 32-year-old, so I'm right at the upper limit of that. So we'll see whether I think if you said to me, in principle, would you like to live in a perfectly operating socialist society? Well, actually, the principles of socialism, I think it all sounds a bit nice and rosy. But actually, if you look at the lives that young people lead today, the things they buy, the things they enjoy, they very much live in capitalist lifestyles. So I think it's probably explaining some of those realities. But I do think, obviously, in the school system, we need to explain the absolute destruction that socialist economies have wrecked throughout history. And I think looking at this idea that, it's just been managed in the wrong way, it was always managed in the wrong way. Give me an example of a successful socialist country. There isn't one.
Ash,
there's a reason for that.
Right. Well, Ash, that question is for you. Is it because young people here haven't really ever experienced what it might be like to live under a proper socialist government?
Well, I think what young people have is an experience of living in a capitalist economy which is failing them. And there's one thing which I'd like to disagree with that was said earlier, which is, well, haven't young people always been more left-wing? That's simply not the case. People always forget that Margaret Thatcher won a majority of young voters. We're talking 18 to 24-year-olds, that exact cohort, which we all like to think of as, living the life of the young ones, left-wing firebrands. That wasn't the case in the 1980s. But what has happened since then, I think, is less to do with shifts of values, but actually a shift in how the economy works, and the fact that that has systematically disadvantaged young people. So in some parts of London, the average house price is 20 times the average wage. And we've seen the single biggest squeeze on living standards since the Napoleonic Wars following the financial crisis. And young people have been the biggest losers in all of that. So you've got an economy where fundamentally people like me are locked out of asset inflation. So we are looking at incredibly vulnerable, incredibly precarious futures. You add on to that the climate crisis, that we look at the fact that the government is not set to meet its own legally binding targets of achieving net zero by 2050. You look at this sense of, you can buy anything you want. You've got all this consumer power, and yet you can't get the things that you really need to live a dignified and secure life. No wonder young people are turning away from capitalism. It's failing them.
And a good example where people should look to a socialist government?
Well, I think we can look at all kinds of socialised public service provision and go, that has succeeded. I'm with you in a critique of authoritarian socialism. I'm a Democrat. I like political freedoms. But when you look at where public services have been delivered in a way which is fair and high quality, those have been collectively owned and managed.
The SNP, I mean, isn't a socialist party, is it a capitalist party?
We're a social democratic party, and I think the important thing from this report, Jo, is to recognise that young people are not just one homogenous group. Now, it's quite a big age range. I've read the report. It goes from age 16 through to 34. But what is not a surprise to me is this idea that people are shunning the kind of failed Tory economic model. That's something that we see in Scotland. That's why, for example, the Conservatives have never won an election in Scotland since the 1950s. But don't be surprised when young people want to see investment in social housing. They want to see good employment policies coming forward. For example, taking action on exploitative zero-hours contracts. All these things the UK government have failed to do. And that's why it's no surprise that young people in Scotland want to make sure that we can have that future, that Scotland gets to choose its own future in a post-pandemic referendum, so that people in Scotland can make their own decisions, not Boris Johnson.
Tom?
I think there is a legitimate point here, and I think there is a housing crisis that we're living with at the moment, and I do think we need to build more houses and we need a more participatory economic system. So I can see why there is a problem with young people today.
Right. I mean, do you think the Conservative government, successive governments, have done enough to help young people across the board?
I think there's been lots of positive steps, but I think when it comes to the housing market, there is a problem, a big problem. You know, and I think we need to have if you want to have capitalism, you have to have capitalists, and that means owning assets. And if we don't have a large proportion of young people owning or even aspiring realistically to own their own home, we have a big problem. So, like, I do have some.
So why therefore discriminate young people when it comes to paying people who are under the age of 25 a different wage from the people that are doing the exact same job as them on the factory floor or elsewhere in the workplace? You know, if the Conservatives are serious about making sure that we have equality for young people, why do we pay people who are under 25 a different level of pay?
Tom?
Well, I don't really think they should be, but I would say, though, that we need to listen to young people who do feel alienated from the economic system. I'm not saying, you know, I am a capitalist, but I'm sort of participatory. We need a participatory economic system, you know, and I think some of the behaviour of global corporate entities, I think we can be firmer on that. You know, so you're not going to have me, you know, that's not the kind of capitalist that I am. I'm a sort of participatory economic.
But in an issue, for example, where the government can legislate for pay equality, that's not, you know, big capital or big corporate organisations. This is the government's baked into its own pay system is pay inequality. Why is the United Kingdom government, led by Boris Johnson, not doing more to protect young people and give them a brighter future?
I think there's lots of great things the government are doing at the moment to support young people, encouraging firms to take on young apprentices. I think, you know, there's many examples of government investing in young people, but actually these planning reforms that the government bring forward, they have been much criticised and derided. But actually, I think we do need to think about how we're going to give young people a stake in the future. And for me, that does involve owning your own home.
Annabelle, listening to Tom talk about the sort of capitalist he is, do you think the Tory party is still a capitalist party?
I mean, I certainly think it's moving away from that. The problem that we've got at the moment is there's a political realignment underway. It's been underway since 2010, and the key swing voters now are traditional Labour supporters who are anti-market, but even more anti-woke, and that's why they're moving towards the Conservative Party. But as we emerge from this crisis, I think that, you know, it's very important that we swing the Overton window back to the right, and that this Conservative government does pursue free market economics. You know, there's a lot to unpack with what the panellists have said in the past couple of minutes. To Tom's point on housing, yes, 78% of young people blame capitalism for Britain's housing crisis, which is ludicrous. It's government intervention and its failure to liberalise planning that is to blame for our housing crisis. And if we could just move to a situation like you have in most OECD countries, you know, bring down housing costs to the OECD average, then that would make a big difference to young people and their quality of life.
All right.
If I may, just to Ash's point on, you know, I want democracy. You know, democratization doesn't make countries richer. If you look at South Korea, Taiwan, Chile, they weren't democracies when their economic liftoff began.
Okay. Let me let Ash in. You've only got 20 seconds, Ash. Respond.
Look, what I'm going to say is that I love that, you know, the IEA loves to talk about government regulation has created the housing crisis. It's not. It's marketisation. We used to have ample council housing in this country, cheap, affordable housing for people. Now, 4 in 10 of those are buy-to-lets. That's the crisis.
Thank you very much, Ash. That's all we've got time for. From all of us here, bye-bye.